Good morning. Good morning. I want to welcome you all here to Gordon Hall. And right across the driveway here, we have Crotty Hall, named after Jim and Pam Crotty. And I want to also welcome everybody who's joining us online. Welcome to this event celebrating the life and work of JimCrotty. This is, of course, a bittersweet occasion. But your being here and online and sharing your reflections and stories about Jim and his work will help many of us, myself included, honor Jim and feel connected to so many of you who loved and appreciated Jim and his many contributions to economics and to our lives. So thank you for being here. After Jim passed last winter, Pollin and I were considering various ways that PERI and the economics department could honor and memorialize Jim. Thankfully, Don Goldstein contacted us and asked us if we wanted to write an article for a special issue of RRPE in honor of Jim. And of course, we said yes. And this also created the opportunity for us to organize this conference in conjunction with Don and the RRPE to combine presentation of these special papers for Jim and also recollections that you all have of Jim and his life and his work. And tomorrow we'll have other papers written in the spirit of Jim and his work. So thanks so much to Don and to ERPI for honoring Jim in this way. I'm very grateful that all of the paper writers were able to be here this morning. Some of you traveled very far distances from Japan, India, Turkey, to pay your respects and reflect your work on Jim and his life. There's one author who couldn't come, Arjun. I don't know if you're out there in cyberspace now, Arjun, but I hope poor Arjun got COVID and couldn't make it. Hope you feel better soon, Arjun, if you're out there. I think the fact that so many of you, all of you who are here, speaks volumes about Jim's impact on so many of them. So this morning we will have two panels that consist of presentations of the RRP papers. Back here on the screen, we have some important information for everybody to look at about the conference and some aspects. Perhaps most importantly, bathrooms are around the corner. This afternoon, we're gonna, after lunch, we'll devote the afternoon to our stories and recollections and funny things we all remember and important things we all remember about Jim. We're very lucky. We're expecting this afternoon that Pam Crotty will be here, as will two of Jim and Pam's daughters, Erin and Alexis. And Pam is so thrilled that so many of you are here. I'm sure she's loved seeing you all. Tomorrow, there'll be a series of panels on topics related to Jim's work. And tomorrow afternoon, we will have some reflections on how Jim's academic legacy is affecting people's teaching and development of their economics programs. We'll have 3 or maybe 4 former students of Jim's closing out the conference by reflecting on his legacy. And then tomorrow afternoon, we'll end the event by having a reception over in Crotty Hall, named after Jim and Pam. Before moving on, I want to thank 2 people who have worked tirelessly and are continuing to work as I speak to make all this happen. First of all, Kim Weinstein, PERI's communication director. Kim. and especially Nicole Dunham. PERI's Director of Operations, I can't thank you both enough for all you have done to help make this event happen. And we have Deb here also manning the some of the technology here to make sure it keeps working properly. Thank you, Deb. Now, many of you were graduate students here and or taught graduate students here. So thanks to some interviews that Arjun, Jayadev, and Josh Mason did of Jim several years ago, we can see what Jim had to say about the choices you all made to come here to study.
I would certainly implore that person to get an economics education, a critical economics education, so that they were empowered to understand the incredible bullshit that comes out of every other source other than from the left. I mean, they'd be empowered to understand why all the anti-labor positions and free trade positions and so on and so, and non-environmental intervention positions and are not true, they're not valid. There's alternative ways to study them and learn them, and I would do. The question would be, is it worth the 5, 6, 7 years to get a PhD? And that, I think, depends on what you want to do.
Well, it sounds to me like Jim thought you all made a very good choice. Now I want to ask Bob Pollin, PERI's co-director and distinguished professor of economics here at UMass, to come up and say a few words.
Thanks, Jerry. I will just say very, very few words. Welcome, everyone. Really wonderful. And I should lift this up. Thank you. Okay. So again, just to say it's just fabulous seeing everybody here. We all obviously have very strong feelings about Jim. You know, his passing, so sad, though it also enabled us to reflect on the incredible contributions he made as a teacher, researcher, as a human being. Amazing. So this is an opportunity for us to connect with his legacy, his memory in all of those aspects. And in part of that process and moving forward with it is, it's great that there is this forthcoming special issue of the Review of Radical Political Economics, which includes papers you're going to hear in a few minutes. And in pulling that together, we really have to thank Don Goldstein, one of Jim's former grad students and co-author of one of the great papers that you guys did. Did you only co-author one together? Yeah, but anyway, it was a good one. Really, I want to just say a word of thanks to Don for taking the initiative, as Jerry said, taking the initiative to pull together the special issue of the RRPE, which then really energized Jerry and myself to build off of what Don was doing. So I just want to thank Don and invite Don to come.
Well, I really don't have much to add to what Jerry and Bob have already said. This event was a labor whose work mainly resided here at PERI, and I was happy to be able to participate and in some small way weave it together with the tribute issue of the PERI journal, the Review of Radical Political Economics, which will be coming out in December. It's been a pleasure to reconnect with so many people that I knew from a long time ago here in honoring Jim, thinking about Jim. I think for a lot of us, it's involved thinking about our own development trajectories and the kinds of impacts that we've tried to make in the world, very much modeled on this man. So I think maybe without further ado, we can move to the first session here. We have several distinguished authors who have contributed to the special issue of the journal. And I'm going to ask you to come up. We'll be giving about 15 minutes per presentation and save some room for a conversation at the end. So we'll try to stick to that 15 minutes. So our first paper is from Jerry Epstein and Bob Pollin. Bob, are you going to jump in too, or all right? Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. Before each of you gives your paper, just give us the one sentence version of who you are, and yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks, Don. Right, the one sentence version of who I am. I could speak for hours. Yes, so Jerry Epstein, co-director of PERI, economics professor here. So this is a joint paper with Bob Pollin. It's the title is Some Reflections on JimCrotty, His Life and Contributions to Economics. I'm going to present the paper now, and then Bob is going to give some reflections on Jim this afternoon. So that's the plan. So I'm going to focus on Jim's contributions to macroeconomics. After giving just a very short few remarks about Jim's life. We all know that Jim was a brilliant and innovative scholar, an extraordinarily generous mentor of graduate students and young professors, a dedicated teacher of undergraduates, and just a wonderful person all around. Jim was an active member of ERPI very early on, and also the Center for Popular Economics, which is an organization which teaches economics to political activists and lay people. And he was very instrumental in helping to create PERI now 25 years ago. Since Jim's death, the outpouring of love for him and grief from his passing from former students all over the world testifies to the impact he's had for 4 decades in his teaching, mentoring, and friendship with students. Jim was well known for his quick and acerbic wit, a lot that we're going to hear a lot about this today, I am sure. But Jim was equally known for his rigorous expectations he held for you all, his students. He often, I am told, and maybe we'll hear more about this, that Jim often wrote comments in red ink on student papers that were longer than the papers themselves. Is this true? Yeah, that's what I've heard. Jim left a huge mark on the field of political economy with his unique blending of insights of Marx, Keynes, and sometimes Schumpeter. And this is the main substantive point that Bob and I try to make in this paper. Jim's contributions, we believe, are his own contribution to Jim's work is a unique contribution, an important contribution to macroeconomics. It's not simply a blend of Keynes and Marx and Schumpeter with some Kolesky thrown in. It's his unique contribution which stands on its own. And I'll try to describe in a minute what we think some of the main components of that contribution are. Starting with his now classic article, Class Conflict, Keynesian Policies and the Business Cycle, published with, written with Ray Boddy, who, yes, right there, Ray. Jim has had an enormous impact on the way heterodox economics is done, macroeconomics in particular. Indeed, my dissertation on the political economy of the Federal Reserve was inspired by Jim and Ray's paper, and he's inspired my work in many other ways as well. Like some other UMass economics faculty, Jim came of political age during the civil rights struggle and the anti-Vietnam War movement of the 1960s. Through his anti-war activism and the people he met at this work, Jim was introduced to the writings of Marx and the broader classical political economy canon, which led Jim to completely rethink the dissertation he was writing at Carnegie Mellon University. He did not drop out of Carnegie Mellon in those days, but he did abandon a near completed mainstream dissertation at significant risk to Jim's career and the livelihood of his whole family, actually. Jim started over with a new dissertation committed to developing Marx's ideas on macroeconomics in order to get his PhD degree at Carnegie Mellon. He eventually got his degree in 1973, but not until after a long struggle with a very powerful member of his department, who I believe might have been provost at the time, who tried to block him repeatedly. This powerful member is Alan Meltzer, who some of you might know was a president of the Libertarian Pellerin Society, and which was originally created by Hayek and Milton Friedman. But Jim prevailed and taught first at Buffalo and then at Bucknell University before moving to the University of Massachusetts at Amherst in 1974. Jim was a gifted public speaker, as you can already see from the snippet he offered us, which made him an extraordinarily effective undergraduate teacher, as well as an expositor of heterodox economics to policymakers and the proverbial layperson on the street. At the urging of some of Jim's colleagues and former students, he focused in the last stages of his career on two book projects. One in which he brought together his important writings on macroeconomics, entitled Capitalism, Macroeconomics and Reality, Understanding Globalization, Competition, and Crisis. And second, in his brilliant capstone performance, Keynes Against Capitalism, his economic case for liberal socialism in 2019, I believe Ray is talking. So what were Jim's contributions to macroeconomic theory and policy? His body of work, in fact, included more than 70 articles written between 1975 and 2018, as well as his 2019 book. Now, this focus that often is, Jim did a synthesis of Marx and Keynes, is partly because that's how he talked about it to his students, to others, that he's doing a synthesis. And that reflects, I think, Jim's modesty. He didn't want to say, I am revolutionizing macroeconomic theory, but I think we think he, in fact, in some ways did. So just to go through some main ways in which we believe Jim really transformed heterodox macroeconomics, we'll start at the beginning. The beginning for Jim, and many of you I'm sure experienced this, was what he called the fairy tale foundation of mainstream macroeconomics. That is the Walrasian auctioneer. Now, Jim hated Walrasian auctioneer, fictional as it was, almost as much as he hated Milton Friedman, who was all too real. The Walrasian auctioneer, this fairy tale that Jim often started his classes with, is a story of a barter economy where unemployment is impossible because no trades take place until prices are at their equilibrium level. And this is not just for now, but for all time in the future, because there's infinite futures markets which tell us on average what's going to happen from now till kingdom come. Throughout his teaching career, Jim devoted enormous time and effort explaining how this framework was fundamentally misguided, but his was not just a critique. He used this as a jumping off point for the development of his heterodox macroeconomics. The next point that Jim made central to his work was the centrality of class conflict, starting, of course, with this paper with Ray Boddy, which I won't talk about because Ray is here. He can talk about it a lot better than I can. Second point that Jim emphasized was the role of capital strike and capital flight. That is, the capitalist class can discipline the working class not just with unemployment, but also by threatening to send money abroad and refuse to invest at home. Jim wrote insightfully and passionately about the role the capital controls can play in helping to mitigate against this threat to the working class, and the importance of socialization of investment as a way of reducing society's dependence on private capital for capital accumulation and employment. The next point that Jim emphasized was the role of money and credit in the economy. Jim devoted a great deal of attention to understanding the role of money and finance. His work here includes his path-breaking early article, which I remember reading early on in my career and completely opened my eyes to the role of money and credit. His 1985 article, The Centrality of Money, Credit, and Financial Intermediation in Marx's Crisis Theory. Marxian economics had largely ignored Marx's work on money and credit. And with this article, Jim really brought it to the forefront and launched, I think, a lot of work by many of us trying to develop some of these ideas within a Marxian or neo-Marxian framework. He later developed a deep understanding of Keynes's monetary and financial theory as an evolution of this point, which he developed throughout his career. The next point is Crotty's analysis of the modes of capitalist competition. Jim devoted detailed attention to how different forms of capitalist competition engender distinct patterns of economic activity. For example, Jim developed the idea of coercive competition. This refers to how capitalists try to defend their market share, sometimes leading to excessive amounts of investment and enormous amounts of excess capacity that can lead to stagnation and even financial crisis. More generally, we see with Jim's work on coercive investment and competition, how he was able to powerfully integrate the analysis of the individual firm behavior with the impact on the economy as a whole. So this leads me to Jim's contribution to methodology in economics. And key here was Jim's idea of the macro foundations of microeconomics and the micro-macro dialectic. Jim argued that the mainstream project of identifying the micro foundations of macro, a central tenet of the new classical revolution, fundamentally misguided. He argued that one cannot understand the incentives and constraints impacting decision-making of the individual unless we understand the constraints coming from the macro economy itself. But at the same time, he did not ignore micro factors, institutional factors. These form a foundation for macro. So it was really a dialectical methodology that Jim taught and practiced in his work. Central to much of Jim's argument about the evolution of capitalism, 5, right? That's good. I thought time was up. I can really slow down now. Central to Jim's approach to macroeconomics was the key role of historical time and fundamental uncertainty. He emphasized the simple fact that macroeconomic activity operates in one direction, historical time, to use Joan Robinson's terms, not logical time. But this is contrary to the Walrasian auctioneer fairy tale that Jim hated. And it's fundamental for investment decisions, the most important decisions under capitalism. Jim was often quoted as saying, quoted Keynes as saying, about the future, we simply do not know. But Jim took it further than that. Because many economists argue that if you assume fundamental uncertainty, that makes it impossible to analyze the evolution of the capitalist economy. It becomes too amorphous, too general, and not concrete enough. I think in one of Jim's most important papers, Are Keynesian Uncertainty and Macro Theory Compatible? Jim described how, in fact, we can understand the role of fundamental uncertainty in macroeconomics by analyzing the actual conventions, institutions that structure the capitalist economy. And by understanding these actual real-life institutions and social conventions, we can understand how fundamental uncertainty actually works, given that capitalists and workers and everybody have to make decisions. They make decisions some way, and it's irrational to believe that they make rational decisions based on rational expectations when there's fundamental uncertainty. So Jim pulled all of these ideas together in a very concrete way in explaining the 2007-2009 great financial crisis. I was very fortunate to have a front row seat to the great financial crisis, because Jim's office was right here, mine is right across the hall. And every morning I would get Jim's report on the emerging great financial crisis. He'd come in with articles from the Wall Street Journal and or the Financial Times with his red pen now circling this article and that article. Can you believe this shit? He would say to me. So I knew it was coming, and Jim knew it was coming. And there were a few other people out there, I guess, who knew it was coming. I only knew it because Jim knew it. And Jim wrote all of this up in an article published in the Cambridge Journal of Economics entitled Structural Causes of the Global Financial Crisis, which is still one of the most widely read articles from the CJE that's ever been written. And Jim was very proud of that fact, as he should have been. He said, he kept coming into my office saying, look, Jerry, I'm still number one. Now, Jim believed that the only way to get this irrational system under some kind of control and to work for the workers and for all of us was we needed to socialize investment. We needed to socialize investment. Now, this is an idea that he felt very strongly about, and he felt very strongly that people needed to understand that Keynes felt very strongly about this. So Jim had a manuscript that he had written while he was visiting Japan about Keynes's work on the socialization of investment, capital controls, what he calls liberal socialism. And he showed me this manuscript and said he thought he might want to write it into a book. And I said, good idea, Jim, except this is really boring. You've got to make it more exciting. So he did. It's just a fabulous book. If you have not read Jim's book, Keynes Against Capitalism, I very strongly recommend that you do. And in this book, Jim makes the case, not just for Keynes, but for himself, about the important role of socializing investment. Doesn't mean centralizing, doesn't mean the Soviet-style central planning. It means having social and economic institutions where society has more say in how investment is organized. And this is a sine qua non for creating a just, stable society. I'll just close by saying there are some very basic things about JimCrotty that many of us know and that we'll be hearing more about today and this afternoon. He remained throughout his life a person without airs, without arrogance. He grew up in the Bronx, New York, the son of a bus driver, and he never forgot his roots. Above all, Jim was devoted to Pam, his wife of 60 years, as well as equally to their children and grandchildren. All of this, Jim's brilliance as a scholar and teacher, his commitment to social justice, his razor-sharp sense of humor, love of good company, his humility, and his commitment to family and friends comprise the huge legacy that Jim created in his 84 years here on Earth. With Jim's passing, we now have the opportunity to walk in his footsteps by honoring this legacy in all the ways that he would embrace. Thank you.
I'm Ray Boddy. The most important reason for being here is to honor Jim, but also that Jim and I started working together in economics at the State University of New York at Buffalo in 1965. What I want to concentrate on today is the policy relevance of Jim. Jerry's already talked about many other aspects, and so I want to focus on the policy part. And on this, I must say that after I read Jim's book, that's the first time in my whole life I ever felt that I was Jim's pupil, because I learned things in there about not only Keynes, but about Jim that I really did not know before I read that book. All right. So now there is going to be some slides put up, I think, and those slides will have more information than you can read faster than I can talk. All right. So whatever you see up there, oh yeah, that's me. We'll start, and then the next slide is Jim's overall approach. Jim had a question that he wanted to ask. He wanted to put his methodology to answer it. And then what I want to do is to take two of his derived policy positions to show how important his work on policy is, right? So Jim's question, next one over, was, oh, by the way, when you see it in bold writing, it means it comes from a bold author, all right? And it's a quotation. So for example, you moved ahead. Jim's question was, the introduction, was Keynes trying to save capitalism or create liberal socialism? And that's what the book nominally is about. But that question has been answered by a lot of people. And one answer is yes. Another answer is no. And a third answer is yes, yes. That he was doing both, okay? So what I want to do is first look at his key methodology. Think over here. Jim traces Keynes's policy positions in great detail from World War I all the way to Keynes's death in 1946. That's why this book is about almost 400 pages. Jim insisted, as Keynes did, that the realism and completeness of assumptions matters. Jerry's already talked on part of that. So the quote there from Jim is, in the historical record, there is no such thing as a generic capitalism. There are only historically, constitutionally and behaviorally unique social formations within which private property and market processes play different roles. And that is what makes Jim's methodology so unique. Now, I want to cover briefly Keynes's positions, which, as Jerry said, is the centerpiece of Jim's approach. And in chapter 24, on concluding notes on the social philosophy toward which the general theory might lead, Keynes says, the outstanding faults of the economic society in which we live are its failure to provide for full employment and its arbitrary and inequitable distribution of wealth and income. After that, a few pages later, Keynes states, I conceive that a somewhat comprehensive socialization of investment will prove the only means of securing an approximation to full employment. If the state is able to determine the aggregate amount of resources devoted to augmenting the instruments of production and the basic rate of reward to those who own them, it will have accomplished all that is necessary. Now, as Jim pointed out many times in that book, is that mainstream Keynesian economists, ever since 1936, have either dismissed or just did not understand this key policy position, okay? Now, to get to the whole policy positions, you need to know the social conditions under which you're making those decisions. And so I take two cases. One was Keynes' policy positions during the secularly stagnant interwar period. And in that period, Keynes saw that capital goods, he thought they were approaching saturation. And that meant that the marginal efficiency of capital was going to fall and fall reasonably quickly. The result of that, as Jim pointed out, is that long-term real interest rates must be driven to zero in order to allow that investment to take place. And to do that, since your interest rates are going to be lower than the real interest rates in other countries, you need capital controls, which, as many of you know, Jerry and Jim and many people here have worked on that over the years. You also needed managed trade, and you needed national self-sufficiency, which meant, Keynes understood that meant you needed a bank that would carry out the things that you needed to socialize investment in your country. And he urged the House of Lords and the Treasury to nationalize the Bank of England. Well, it finally got nationalized in 1946. Now, the next case that I want to look at is Keynes's UK post-war economic planning for liberal socialism. Now, that print, if you can see it, then I don't need to read the whole thing. As I said, you can read faster than I can talk. But there's some things there I do want to read, if I may. And that is the first paragraph. The Treasury was also empowered to raise or lower the pace of public and semi-public investment in order to moderate the amplitude of business cycles around the full employment trend. There would be no planned deficits in the government's current account, but the all-important capital budget could run short-term deficits when necessary. However, the portfolio of investment projects to be supported by the Treasury would be expected to pay for themselves over the long run. Then I want to go to the last paragraph of Jim's. The proposed post-war economic system Keynes put before the key ministries from 1943 to 1945 clearly constituted an economic revolution in support of democratic or liberal socialism. It was a revolution of class power as well. Sustained full employment would empower labor in the multidimensional struggles with capital. There would be no significant reserve army of unemployed to weaken labor's bargaining power, and the new welfare state would dramatically increase labor's fallback position to its negotiations with capital. All right. Now, what I want to do, which I think is in the spirit of Jim's work from Keynes, is to just talk about an extension of what I call the Crotty Keynes approach to address climate change and social justice. And I start that, look at PERI for things on climate change and social justice, and you will not be surprised that I found a lot of articles there. And the one I chose was by Azad and Chakraborty that was written actually in 2023, published originally in Mumbai as a weekly. And I would have never have found it in Mumbai, but I found it at the PERI site. All right. And the first part of the quote from Azad and Chakraborty is, what would this global green program look like? As far as the transitional path is concerned, it requires the more, I put in there, the more prosperous North to not only balance its own emissions, but also unconditionally contribute both technologically and financially for the poor South to balance their own as well. While in principle, this seems simple, perfect. It is not so easy. That's perfect, not my reading, but Don's cherry. Is easy to achieve or even to articulate. Now, as Jim told you earlier, told us, is methodology. You need to know what is going on and what kind of capitalism you're looking at, right? Well, if we do that today and not in 1936, what you will be faced with globally and looking at global change and global injustice is that we are living in a world where there is bipolar military, economic, and political competition to strengthen at least two coalitions, one around the United States and one around China. That is just as clear as it's going to be. Now, each of those powers need to strengthen their coalition. And they will do that in a number of ways. But this is almost that paradox of out of evil comes good, or out of greed may come altruism. But that means to me that the United States, for example, will find it in its interest to socialize investment by investing in Honduras, Guatemala, Costa Rica, and they will do what's already being done in the US when you look from the US to West Virginia or another state, is that the US will find it to its advantage to socialize investment and to take funds from the US to create full employment in Honduras and Costa Rica. And China, of course, is already doing that in Africa, where it's investing its work in the same way. So I think what you will be facing is essentially a case where the next round of Crotty Keynes socialism investments is not simply self-sufficiency in one country, but around the global situation. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ray. Our next speaker is Michele Naples, who I believe is going to talk to us about why we don't have that revolution in class power that Keynes envisioned.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to say quickly, I learned Marx from many people at UMass. I learned Keynes from Jim and from Leonard Rapping, but it was Jim who really taught me how to put it together and always helped think in terms of historical processes rather than equilibrium models. And money was not a thing, a veil thrown over general equilibrium, but was an active part of a process. I try to start my intro macro money section saying, you know, money is a social relationship. I have to convince you of that. Which by the end of it, hopefully they have a clue about. This paper is about how do we think about what's happened to the reserve army of the unemployed in the United States in the last few decades. In looking at it, it seems to me unemployment has been much larger than we've been led to believe. And I think Jim would care to know. We got the first evidence from, Ray and Jim about what happens over the course of the business cycle and how unemployment pressure on people. By the way, Blinder came and talked at our college a few years ago and talked about the reserve army and the unemployed. Am I hearing this? The question is, how do we measure that unemployment that impinges on workers? Sorry, can you hear? So I can't face that way, right? Okay. Yeah, I will. You have to lean in. This is really not. Okay. So you probably are aware of U3 and U6 different measures of the magnitude of unemployment. Graph, it's always helpful. The higher one is U6, which includes people who are discouraged. They've given up looking because there are no jobs in their area as yet. They'll come back when the labor force, when the jobs expand, and involuntarily part-time because of economic circumstances. That U6 runs 1.6 to 2 times as big as the standard measure U3. And it passed that 10% unemployment benchmark. Stigler referred to it in the early 80s. That's what we economists consider depression level unemployment. So I'm going to use that as a depression level. In 94, 95, in 2003, in 2008 to 2015, and 2020, 21. I have always taught my students about another measure of unemployment, which I don't know why we don't talk about more. The unemployment rate is the product of 2 aspects of unemployment: incidence and duration. What proportion of labor force experiences unemployment, and what proportion of the year are they out? And if you kind of think it through, it becomes clear. It wasn't that easy to find incidence data. I had seen it when I was younger in the 80s. It was part of the Bureau of Labor Statistics handbook, but they stopped collecting it in the Reagan years. And so there's this hole in the data, and it took me weeks with the business librarian searching. So we finally found it under, for later years, under work experience, not unemployment experience. But there was still a hole. So then I contacted the BLS, who assured me this didn't exist. And then when I pointed them to their own publications, they were able to find archival data. It's like, really? So this is how duration has varied. This is the huge duration is coming in the financial crisis as it kept going and going and going. But here is incidence is the orange one above the unemployment rate. Incidence was very high in the earlier periods. It's down lately as unemployment's higher, incidence lower. But my concern is that the percentage of people experiencing unemployment, the joke is, if you're unemployed, it's a recession. If I'm unemployed, it's a depression, right? And so the experience of unemployment really puts pressure on you that watching it may or may not. So that's an empirical question ultimately. And that's what I'm asking us to do. If you look at incidence, it exceeded 10% for more than 80% of the period. Exceeded 20% in 75 and 82, in case we thought 75 was just a recession. And it typically runs, 1.7 to 3.6 times the regular unemployment rate. So, I mean, if it helps to do I figure you guys are economists, so you can do the math of like, if we have half the labor force out of work, then it'd be twice, if we have 4% unemployment, then it either means 4% for a year or 8% for 6 months or 12% for 4 months, or you see what I mean? Of that year. Now, of course, some unemployment spells last longer. What about unemployment compensation, which we had understood to help mitigate unemployment? And each state has a lot of leeway in terms of how they're going to manage it, how they're going to set the level of compensation, what proportion of. In New Jersey, it's 60% of the median pay, but you actually get a little bit higher percentage if you have dependents. The commitment to unemployment compensation really paled after 75, after the end of the Vietnam War. And while it was couched in terms of labor supply and all that nonsense, it was as if they believed Crotty and Rapping's argument that you really had to beat people up in order to get them to work harder and to restore profitability. We started seeing, I thought it was Reagan, but it's before Reagan, we started seeing taxation of unemployment benefits. In 79, those making above 3 times the poverty rate were liable, but not 100%. In 82, that threshold was dropped to less than twice the poverty rate. And then the tax reforms of 86, everybody's unemployment compensation is fully taxable. Oh, we're going to give you the earned income tax credit. Lovely if you have a job. But actually, from my money, it's a subsidy for low wage employers. And you get nothing if you're unemployed. So, what would Keynes say? What would Crotty say? The consequence was we didn't get that redistributive impact come the 82, 83, 80, 81, 82, 83 recessions. And so Texas oil was clobbered, Oklahoma was clobbered. You didn't get the money going to those areas that would have gone previously if you're taxing it away. Republic Bank Holding Company ran out, failed in 86, threatening 1/4 of the FDIC fund. 10% of the commercial banks failed in 89 to 91. Is anyone watching? Choices of consequences. There's ways in which I feel like the capitalist economy and the alcoholic family have a lot in common, What about take-up ratios? I only learned about take-up ratios when I had to file for unemployment compensation and couldn't get it. We furloughed faculty for a couple of weeks during COVID, and we all applied and we weren't getting paid. And so we started there's a list for the union on a different, you have to use your home email. We started talking to each other, and everyone was telling different stories from the Department of Labor, why they hadn't gotten paid. It was like they were making it up. So another colleague and I put together a letter. We collected data and ultimately got 200 names of faculty who hadn't gotten there. It's not a big school. It's the College of New Jersey. Faculty and staff who hadn't gotten unemployment comp. Got a letter we wrote to the governor. We sent it because she's from Poland. And so she thought, well, we'll send it to the president of the college first to let her know we're doing this. And then she wrote a cover letter that got the governor's attention. And he chewed out the labor commissioner who chewed us out. You should have talked to us. Yeah, you don't answer your phone. But in the process, he said, look, we're funding 51% of those who are unemployed. Mississippi, it's only 9%. I should be happy. But what happened to a program that was going to kick in and buoy demand? Don't you get it? So that was stunning. It took people as much as a year to get their money, but the commissioner had somebody call us and people get their financing. So this question of take-up rates shows, and it's really hard to find the data. Blank and Card did a study with CPS data. So I feel like this is a dissertation waiting to be done, to take a look at this kind of cross-section. And I mean, I'd love it as panel data looking over time, what's happened to take-up ratios on unemployment compensation and what it means for how the economy works. Again, choices of consequences. They say in 87, the regional averages ranged from less than half in the mountain, west, south, central regions to 85% in the mid-Atlantic and New England region. I know in New Jersey 20 years ago, 25 years ago, it looked like 50% of those unemployed were filing for unemployment. That's what we thought. We didn't know that the software being used was already out of date, the COBOL software, and that the software systems weren't handling it. And so people were giving up. The lawyer at the college had given up trying to get his unemployment comp because he couldn't get through. It's like, if a lawyer's given up, guess what? Wage workers are given up. I just thought, he's like, can I go on your list? Yeah, enjoy. The level of, I don't know what the level of proportion of wage reimbursement is, but the levels vary from $823 a week in Massachusetts, $823 to $235 in Mississippi. Really, our average wage is 1/4 as high. The length of time eligible is typically 26 weeks. Some states it's 20 and some it's 12 to 16. Florida, North Carolina, Iowa. Okay, I did skip something I did mean to talk about, which is the magnitude of the weekly compensation. Here's the top 10. And Mississippi being the low, and then the length of benefits. With the two-earner households, there's various data on family and household income. You can see where the dual income rose and then kind of came down a little bit. It's in the 60 to 66% range. But the question Mark's raised is this really going to help household income, family income? Or is it going to just mean different parts of the household earn it? So we've got family income in the red and household income in blue. And with family income, you can see this is real terms. Steep rise through 70, flattening, somewhat of a rise up and down, and similar pattern with households to the extent it was collected. So while there is still some rise, it's certainly at a lower rate. But that's a different question. The real question I'm asking is, what does it do to the impact of unemployment? If everybody's out of work in the household, if your whole area is, clobbered, then it's the same as before. But if one's out of work and the other's working, it's going to mitigate it. So that could be a positive for the working class. And so basically, I think that if we talk about the impact of the Reserve Army on macroeconomic variables, wage growth, productivity growth, profit rate, and so forth, we need to have a richer understanding of what that Reserve Army is than just an unemployment rate.
All right. Thanks very much. My name is Arjun Jayadev, and I'm a professor of economics at Azim Premji University in Bangalore, India. And, being in this room, actually, I joined this program 25 years ago. It was 25 years ago. And my life is sort of flashing before my eyes quite literally, because in the front row, I have all my teachers, Jerry, Bob, David, Nancy, Sam. I have my first housemate, my first office mate, in this room. Then the people who gave me my first job in the room. I'm not even kidding. Arthur and Randy, the people who, where I am now, who've inspired me the most among many people, Jayati, Sunanda, Vamsi, who's not here. And then finally, my students who are now joined the program, so Meghna and Mihir. So it is a very emotional moment. Talk about the collision of historical time and logical time. This is the moment. And of course, behind me is Jim. There's many, many things I miss about Jim, but one of the things I miss most, and you'll all probably remember this, is his voice. He had a particular voice, particular way of speaking, which would which was riveting, right? And many of you know this line. This was one of his lines. If Keynes were alive today, and he'd claim it, and he'd pause and he says, "He'd be old and drooling, and so listen to me instead," right? That was his line. And I thought it was a line only for us, but he did year on year, apparently. And I know only because Nancy mentioned this in one of her articles. I think, when he would say that, the reason it was great was you really felt in some sense that you were listening to an old master when you heard Jim. He was a person who had this particular way about him, a particular presence, which made you feel like it's not just economics you're learning about, but you're learning about economics in the service of something larger, economics in the service of life almost. Many years ago, the last time I saw him was with Josh when we went to do the interview that some of you saw earlier. And it was, of course, always wonderful to speak with him. And I also realized that in some sense, his life, as is many of the lives here, is unrepeatable. His particular presence, his history is from the Bronx, the particular things that he got into in his life, the Vietnam War, Reaganism, all of those things contributed to his way of thinking. But really, I think why, in some sense, he was the embodiment of Keynes or Marx and so on for us, was that his life and his economics was in the service of, the project was social transformation. Economics is social transformation. It's such a powerful thing to be part of that feeling that this was something that you were going to get into for the rest of your life. Of course, his early work, it was, as we've heard, he was really kind of the expert at really synthesizing Marx and Keynes in ways that, many of us found so inspiration and actually was so incredibly difficult. His early work was, very much more in the Marxian vein. His work on class conflict and imperialism and so on with Ray Boddy, who I was just amazed to see is a real person, because for us, Ray Boddy and Crotty was just something that we kept, we had as our references, just like the first reference you put in, right? So it's great to actually see the person here. And of course, I was in light of the Vietnam War and the particular structure of the U.S. economy at that point of time. But by the 1980s, I think he had moved more to Keynes, and the word Keynes probably showed up much more often than the word Marx. But even then, because he was kind of analyzing very early the rise of finance and finance capitalism, the way that we've sort of understood it, neoliberal finance in the last 30, 40 years. Even then, he was trying to synthesize certain ideas. And if we will, what Josh and I call the Minskian Marx or the Marxian Minsky, trying to put in that famous paper that Jerry referenced, the 1985 paper, trying to really understand how these kind of debates went together, whether you could understand declining rate of profit and its impact on the capitalist economy without understanding finance. And Tim's answer was that you had to actually imbricate both of those two and really understand, finally, in some sense, that the real sector was the final determinant, if you will. So there was that. There was his work on owner-management conflict, really seeing finance capitalism as embodying two different aspects of capital, the owner and the manager, and how we have to actually start to reanalyze the system in light of those two. So in many ways, the first part of his work was to make, in some sense, the synthesis go from Keynes to Marx, to sort of understand how, in some sense, finance was so central to the development of the capitalist economy. But by the 1990s, he had moved, and in some sense, that was the project of the next 20 years, if you will, or 25 years, which is to bring Marx to Keynes, and that's what Josh will speak about.
Yes, so as we all know, Jim's last project was very much in the spirit of this Marx-Keynes synthesis that was in the service of a radical politics. It was a reconstruction of Keynes's socialism, a demonstration that the call for a more or less comprehensive socialization of investment at the end of the general theory was not a throwaway line, but reflected a systematic program. This work was present in earlier pieces, was Keynes a corporatist, and his piece on capital controls, and of course the draft manuscript of that book circulated in this department and was read by many of us years before it came out. Keynes, in Jim's telling, was a socialist, self-described socialist, but this did not necessarily involve public ownership. Socialism meant a progressive reorientation of the investment decision away from the private profit motive and towards conscious planning to meet social needs. This could take many concrete forms. It certainly involved pushing the interest rate towards zero, as Ray mentioned, I believe, and some insulation of national economies from external pressure. It also involved a lot of what we would today call industrial policy, public measures to shift labor and other resources from declining sectors to more promising ones. And importantly, it meant creating space for formally private enterprises to autonomously pursue their own socially useful forms of production without undue pressure from their notional owners or from finance. And this, as Arjun was just mentioning, was also a central concern in much of Jim's work. So all of this, and here I think there is an important overlap with Marx, all of this is an incremental process that grows organically out of the development of the capitalist system itself. As Keynes said in a line that Jim quotes in the book, where he differed from doctrinaire socialists was not at all in his goals. Rather, it was, he said, that they missed the significance of what is actually happening all around us. So let's turn to what is happening around us now. It seems likely to us, as I think it also did to Ray, that if Jim were alive today and younger, he would be thinking about the problem of climate change, which is truly the great crisis of the 21st century. And I think this is, climate change also illustrates the value of a Crottian perspective in several ways. First of all, if we look at the crisis we have just lived through, the economic crisis that followed the pandemic, what makes it different from the crises that we've experienced previously is that it was not about finance. It was not about an instability in the flow of money through the economy, but about a disruption in the real activity of production. The pandemic, we might hope, was a unique event, but certainly climate disruptions are likely to lead to many more such crises in the future. And this, I think, brings us back towards Marx, not specifically necessarily about profits or class conflict, but in the broader sense that it is the production process itself that can be the source of instability and breakdown, even when that is mediated or amplified by finance. The second sort of Crottian theme that I would highlight is the move towards decarbonization that we've already seen, which I think has really been quite remarkable and underappreciated in its speed and scale. The growth of solar and wind power, the spread of electric vehicles, and so on has been much faster than almost anyone would have anticipated a decade or two ago. Now, this progress is not thanks simply to market incentives. It is not simply a result of price signals. Despite the consensus not so many years ago that climate policy meant carbon pricing, no systematic carbon price has been implemented. But there has been public policy in the form of incentives, in the form of subsidies, in the form of loan guarantees, but not by and large in the form of direct public ownership. So progress that we've made has been in this sort of vast middle ground between simple price incentives on the one hand and direct public ownership and central planning on the other hand. And I think it's on this middle ground that Keynes's liberal socialism really comes into its own. The socialism of investment, as Jim highlighted, means a whole range of forms of planning that can be incrementally substituted for the pursuit of private profit. The third element here that I think is important to emphasize is Jim's insistence that Keynes believed that capitalism was historically specific, that markets had worked to organize production, in Keynes's view, in the pre-World War I period for specific reasons having to do with the relatively limited importance of long-lived fixed capital, the pursuit of investment as a way of life rather than a single-minded focus on returns, the unique position of Britain at the center of the world financial system, and so on, and that these conditions, once they ceased to apply, meant that markets no longer served as appropriate coordinating mechanisms. And I think we're sort of rediscovering today, in the response to climate change and potentially other crises, the limitations and failures of market coordination in much the same way. It's not something that has to be sort of forced on people. It's kind of almost driven by the logic of events, just as Keynes in the 1920s was very focused on the problem of the decline of the British coal industry. many of the same problems now arise in the transition away from carbon. The last theme I want to bring up here is the one of fundamental uncertainty. As we know, one of Keynes's lines that Jim liked to quote the most was the one that on many important questions about the future, we simply do not know. Keynes' examples, prospect of a major European war, or as he put it, the position of private wealth owners in the social structure of society a generation from now. Now, Keynes emphasized this as one of the reasons why private profit could not be a suitable guide for investment decisions, because the information that one would need to evaluate the return on a long-lived capital project simply doesn't exist. But there's a more positive spin on this. The reason the future is unknown is that it hasn't happened yet. The reason the future is unknown is that it is the result of the decisions that we individually and collectively have yet to make. The fact that the future is unknown means that it is still within our power collectively to choose what it will be. And this, I think, is something that Jim never lost sight of. Jim, I think, was always throughout his life, always believed and was really fundamentally optimistic about the possibility of a fundamental transformation, that the future could be different from what we've experienced up till now. I think this is the positive side of we simply do not know. And I think that's perhaps one of Jim's most important lessons for us here today.
All right. Well, thank you to the panelists for some excellent papers, for making yourselves available here, and now for being available for questions from the audience. Jerry was just alerting me that we will go back and forth between questions from those here in the room and those who have joined us online. So who would like to start us off? David?
Can you hear me through the mask? Okay. One quick question for Ray Boddy and one quick question for Michele Naples. Ray, you mentioned that the currently developing competition between coalitions centered around the U.S. and around China might lead to the U.S. Side investing in Honduras to try to compete with China's activities in the global South. I wondered, what about the lesson from the last such two-power competition, which also involved the CIA intervention in other countries, the military going out, not just capital going out, coups d'etats. Is that likely to be a feature of this period? Are we seeing some evidence of that? And then a quick question. Are you going to collect questions and then have responses?
No, I think we'll go one at a time.
Okay, then let me just quickly to Michele, then they can both answer. And that is, with incidence of unemployment, that is, what percentage of the labor force is unemployed over a year? Doesn't that have indicate high incidence is bad for workers' welfare, because many more of them than you think, will be unemployed at some point. But a high rate may increase the bargaining power of labor, because currently employed workers will believe that while they may be unemployed, it won't last long, because your data show very high rate in the 1960s, when everyone thinks labor's bargaining power was very high.
Yes. Right in here. Very quickly, David's quite correct that the CIA is going to be very active in Central America. It's also going to be very active in areas of Africa and Asia. And I think its competitors will be equally active in those places. And things are going to be dangerous in such a structure. And it goes back to, I think, what Josh Mason said, is that there is uncertainty, and it's really important that those forces that are, say, carrying out investments in Central America and competing, say in Caracas, that they know also what is going on and will demand as much as they can that this be done in a social democratic way. And I agree with your basic point.
I know, David, I was surprised to see the high incidence in the earlier period. I just think we have to measure, we have to look at it and we have to understand what's going on and look at duration. And it's an empirical question. I'm currently working on the role of the drug war in pulling people out of unemployment and putting them in jail, putting them on probation. Do you know that probation parole counts is 300% the level of those actually in prison, and you're all constrained so that's another study of the way in which the reserve army is much bigger than we think. But I think it's just a bigger concept than, look at the unemployment rate and throw it in the equation.
All right, thank you. Let's take one more question, at least from the group here, before we turn to our online guests.
Thank you all for really terrific reminiscences and presentations. I think that I'm particularly interested in the climate change and JimCrotty's thought question. And I wanted to pursue this question of the socialization of investment. I think we are seeing some shifts. I think if you look at different really practical terms, China's efforts to electrify the economy, IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act here in the US, I think there's a lot to be thought about in the details, because in some ways, investment is always socialized. The British Empire, went to work to, socialize a form of investment. So kind of fights over the spoils are very important. And have the institutions in which the returns from that investment will be shared or not shared. So I don't know if you want to offer some reflections, thinking about sort of what are the institutions for, for generating the returns and sharing the returns. Yeah, they're always socialized, but social means different thing. There's social and there's antisocial. Some reflections would be welcome.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And of course, it's true. Investment is always socialized. The state, the public always creates the conditions for private investment and always implicitly directs it in certain directions and discourages in other directions. That's absolutely true. There's no such thing as pure private investment or pure, markets. But I think there are a couple of dimensions where one can distinguish some of what we're seeing now. One is the degree to which this is a conscious, visible political process. In sort of normal times, that the state support for certain forms of investment over others takes place kind of out of sight. It's treated as if it was just setting of basic ground rules. And I think we're seeing now, under the pressure of events, a much more visible political effort to do this in a way that's at least potentially open to, democratic accountability. I think there's also a little bit of a difference in how sort of fine-grained that direction is, in the sense that there's a difference between sort of setting conditions in a broad way for certain favoring certain types of activity over others, and doing a more targeted kind of thing. You will spend, and obviously you could imagine much more targeted, industrial policy than what we've seen in the US, or I'm not sure, I'm not going to speak about China, but certainly in the US you can imagine. But at the same time, what we have seen in terms of, really favoring very specific activities like, battery production or chips production is more targeted than what we've historically seen. And in that sense, I would argue, is shifting the locus of decision-making and authority from the private pursuit of profit to some sort of collective planning process.
Perhaps the ethanol industry is a good example of how the spoils are divvied out, coming down in a highly irrational way.
So
do we have
anything from the online audience? Any questions?
Kim, others coming to us from afar?
Hi, Kim.
All right, we'll come back to the room. Gary.
First of all, I'd just like to
Wait 1 second. They can't hear him.
watch your mouth now.
I'd just like to ask everybody to give a round of applause to Arjun and Josh for their wonderful legacy interview that is now a gift that we've got forever. So thank you both. And Michele, I was really glad to see your drilling down into things. I know that Bob Pollin did some great work starting in the 90s about the way that we measure or don't measure unemployment. I was wondering about long-term unemployment and how that interacts with the two-earner families and so on, because this seems to be a really important trend. People that just withdraw, and as Bob pointed out many years ago, you're no longer being counted even.
Good question. Part of what we saw was people retiring early and picking up Social Security much earlier than they would have, right? I interpret that as long-term unemployment. What will it mean? I don't know.
Yes.
By the way, can you please introduce yourselves when you speak?
Hi, I'm Lenore Palladino. I'm an assistant professor here. And I might be one of the few people in the room who didn't know Jim. And so this is really wonderful for me. And so my question is sort of maybe to Bob and Jerry, but really to all of you who were students of Jim's, going a little bit above and beyond the paper's, specificity, but what made him such a great teacher, and what lessons do you think you've taken into your teaching that made him not just a good teacher substantively, but it sounds like an incredible mentor? And what are the lessons we should learn from that as a community?
Thank you. I think I'll give this to Arjun to answer that.
In our piece, we wrote a little bit about Jim as a teacher, and one of the things he would say was, people would come to his room as graduate students, and all the graduate students who came to the program would go to his room and cry whenever they had trouble. So there's something incredibly warm about Jim and very respectful about students. And I have to say that was something that, it stuck with me. The fact that someone could be, this kind of extraordinary person, but was just warm, respectful, and took your struggles as real. I think that was something that, in fact, Jim was not the only person. That's actually something that is shared quite broadly across many of the people in this room. But Jim was kind of the embodiment of that. The other thing I think that it's hard to kind of fully parse is something which actually Jerry said a little earlier. Jim was actually not just synthesizing Marx and Keynes. He was actually giving, right through those 40 years that he was doing this, his own version of macroeconomics, which you really didn't get anywhere else. And in that sense, there was you felt like you were in touch with something vibrant, new, and just gigantic in terms of its scope. So I'm not afraid, I'm not sure that any of us can repeat Jim, but we can certainly, continue to be energized by him as a teacher. I don't know, other people will probably have many more things to say on this.
I'll make a comment on that. I was Jim's PhD student advisee during the mid to late 80s. And Jim, he was magnetic, he was brilliant, he was inspiring. And as in any student-teacher relationship where that's the case, very seductive in terms of how you saw the world and thought about the world. And he was okay with that, but he really wanted you to, and he insisted that you go out and find your own way of looking at the world. And I'll never forget going to him with my first dissertation proposal and him reading it and sort of sitting back in his chair and saying, well, this is very good, JimCrotty. He said, I want something that's Don Goldstein. My wife wasn't happy because she just wanted me to finish the damn thing and get done. But I went back to the drawing boards and it was a great thing. Yeah. Other questions online, in the room?
Okay, well, I think we started a little early, so we can end a little bit early. Thank you, Don. Thanks to all the panelists for wonderful presentations. So it's if you could come back, we get an little extra break. So come back at 11:30 for our second panel. Thank you very much.